folks who don't know your story, who are less familiar with your journey. I'd love to start with your experience growing up in East Palo Alto, and just a little bit about how that experience has informed the way you approach politics, and the way that you even just understand and kind of conceptualize the housing crisis across our broader region.
Yeah, no, most definitely. So I'm born and raised in East Palo Alto, and it's I think the most succinct way of really explaining, the struggle of being from EPA is that you have this sense of you grew up on the other side of the tracks, that society gave the short end of the stick, that you weren't given the resources. And I think what's really unique about EPA is that, of course, you have wealth inequality as an issue around the world, around the country. But what is so unique about our experience is that right across our doorstep, as a matter of fact, within our name, East Palo Alto, you have a city, literally a stone's throw, that has more space, more housing. And strangely enough, the inequality is racialized. So a lot of the Black and brown community don't feel seen in Palo Alto unless they mowing the lawn stereotypically or serving the dinner. And so I think growing up, there was this resentment for what it means to be elite, privilege, of wealth, and housing comes into that because more and more it's like the stereotype of Latinos or working class community, Black folks living together in multiple families. I mean, that's just straight economics. We just can't afford to have houses to our name by ourselves. My family was a part of that. My uncles and my relatives for many years, we lived side by side. And I think, a lot of times it's out of economic necessity. And so the housing crisis really shapes the foundation for how we think about our identity, because it shows us where we start with. And so growing up in East Palo Alto, you have a lot of pride, a lot of love for the city. I love my community, the people in it. You learn to really be proud of that from the beginning. But I think you do have that chip on your shoulder where you're always thinking you're about to be slighted. Somebody who's even presumably wants to help you might have something embedded in it that's going to disadvantage you, as has been our history. And so I think when I think about what it means to be progressive and allyship, it's how do you create buy-in for a community that has seen so little from people who have so much. And I think I have a lot of optimism by virtue of my age, my background, but if I have to be real sober about what EPA conditions in me, it is this frustration that how the hell do we have this inequality in the Silicon Valley? And how do we have statistics like we do about education, about health outcomes, about being in a zip code, and that can tell you how your life outcome is? So I think it's a lot of these litanies of issues that it makes no sense to a UFO looking at Earth and looking at our area being like, how are they not having it figured out? And I think it's the resentment. I think it's the chip on your shoulder, but I also think it's the pride, it's the resilience, it's the ability to adapt and to really embrace the difficulty and the struggle, because that has been our tradition, that has been our history. So it's two sides of the same coin. Resilience, adversity, resentment, but how can we transcend that, go beyond that, and collaborate and create the partnerships we need to make this place affordable for everybody? That has been the telltale of COVID, but that's been our message since day one as a city, no doubt about it.
Right, and I'm glad you brought up resilience and kind of change from within and community leadership, especially in light of kind of your run for city council last year, your successful run for the city council last year. I'd love to just hear a little bit about kind of why you decided to run. You mentioned your own early experience, you mentioned overcrowding, you mentioned kind of the stark, wealth gaps between the community and between, one of the largest and most wealthy corporations, which is on, your basically on your front door in East Palo Alto. But what did you see in your community that made you want to run, and what did you hope to actually achieve in office?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think it's important for people to understand. I didn't have any prior to running for office. I didn't have any political official engagements. I didn't join a commission. I wasn't part of a committee. But keep in mind, I had left EPA at 18, and I had done the thing that a lot of us young kids, generation of the so-called American dream, we go to school, we get an education. We don't have parents that went to college. We want to get a degree, hopefully uplift not just ourselves, but our family, our community, our neighborhood. And I had been privileged, as you've been saying, to go to some of the best universities around the country, around the world. And I don't take that lightly. I don't take it as a flex, its own sake. I take it as it's a privilege and a blessing. But it made all the more stark because I had left when I was 18, 2012, 2020, 19, really, COVID hit. And I had come back from England during the pandemic. I'm coming from Oxford, I'm coming from Duke, I'm coming from Rutgers. And I see this almost like reverse culture shock where a lot of the issues when I had left were still there and maybe even exacerbated in some instances. And COVID, it's kind of weird for me to say it in this way, but COVID was my wake up call, my catalyst to say, if you're not going to show up at this point, when are you going to show up? The next crisis, the next pandemic? If I want people to be invested, like I said up top of the meeting, if I want people to be invested in making change, but I'm not doing anything, then I'm being hypocritical. So I think I ran for office because I wanted to show above all that it can be done. That someone who may not have the endorsements or have the political connections or all the dynasty, if you will, can rustle up and muscle up the resources and with the right policy, right? I ran on rent forgiveness, running on safer streets, and we're getting on those issues. But that progressive change is a popular thing. People want to live in a place they can call their own. A lot of these policies that are demonized as socialism or as, not American, actually, a lot of people growing up are in agreement of that. They want a health clinic. They want something that they want safe ways to give their kids access to resources and nutrition and so forth. So I ran because the circumstances pushed me to be in the forefront. If it weren't for COVID, I might not have run because I would have been comfortable with getting a check, trying to get a salary, maybe showing up to the meetings, but not trying to push the envelope of what's possible in our community. And particularly, I'll end with just saying, there wasn't any young people in the council prior to, we had Laura Martinez for a minute. Shout out to Laura doing her thing, but how can we make that sustainable? Not a one-off thing, but making sure that there's a succession plan that is not just the one or two names that young people feel invested in politics. If we're not in there changing it up, how can we be surprised that people feel disenchanted? We're not in those spaces. So I'm very, very invigorated to see Lizette, to see James, to see my young fellow, Gen Zers or millennials, you want to call it that, into politics, because that's what it's going to take for us to have a piece of the pie. We have to be bold and take risks and collaborate. And even if we mess up along the way, right, we don't may have the policy right. That's part of civic change. It's having the courage to stand up and show up, and then creating that spark so that everybody else can put their input. So yeah, but it's about shaking the status quo in a respectful way, but in an insistent way, and that's part of making change. Every generation has it.
And I think a lot of the change that a lot of us have been talking about these days relates to housing. It relates to housing. And last year when you published an op-ed in the Stanford Daily. Actually, it'd be great if someone could drop a link to this op-ed in the chat. But the op-ed was called "The House I Can't Afford to Live In," for those folks who haven't read it. And you talked about housing justice in Silicon Valley. And I think it's just a really outstanding piece, just as a historical context for, I think, housing and justice and segregation, as well as for the contemporary implications. So I want to talk about both those things, a little bit of the history of how housing connects to race and how it connects to justice.
For sure.
And then I want to talk a little bit about, okay, well, what does that mean for contemporary housing policies, for the housing elements that cities like Palo Alto and East Palo Alto are putting together? So, you start on the history, actually, in your op-ed. You note that kind of formal housing segregation persisted in the Bay Area all the way into the 1960s. And for folks who are less familiar with this history, can you just share a little bit about what does housing segregation look like in our community and how it was actually sustained?
Sure. And it's important to understand it's not just a Bay Area thing, it's a US thing. I mean, we built in the bones of housing a deliberately racist, and I don't mean that lightly, a racist policy of excluding non-white people the ability to have a house to call their own. When you look at the HOA, the homeowners, the early 20th century housing program that the federal government created and subsidized for people. Those did not include people of color. We have this term called redlining, which directly comes from, there were communities that were carved up and said which ones had, grade A, meaning they can receive loans, and which ones cannot receive federal loans. And those that got the grade D were by and large black and brown, aka redlining. In this particular iteration in the Bay Area, you have a couple things. Number one, you have racial restricted housing. I encourage you all to look at the 1960s covenants clauses of Palo Alto, where it says very deliberately, up until 1960, I believe, that no person who is Oriental or non-Caucasian, not of the Caucasian race, can live in Palo Alto unless they're a servant of the household, right? So, within my grandmother's generation, my parents' generation, we have in the bones of housing the exclusion of people that look like me, right? So that's number one. But even when we go beyond that paradigm, we start having, people, you have African Americans moving from the South, great migration. They're going to California, they're going to Texas, they're going westward. And they look at places like Oakland, places like, the Bay Area. Well, what happened was a policy called blockbusting. I didn't mention that in the Stanford Daily piece, but essentially you have this practice where realtors are scaring the white residents of East Palo Alto at the time, before it was EPA, unincorporated county, and other places, saying, we have black folks that are moving into the neighborhoods, creating white flight, right? But then you have folks flipping it, realtors flipping it, and selling those homes twofold, threefold, fourfold the price to the African Americans, knowing the yearning that they have for having housing for their own. So, part of the reason we don't have wealth is because the government hasn't invested in our intergenerational wealth. So, of course, and you have to understand that historically, the Bay Area, and I mean since the 19th century, has thrived off people of color, particularly Latinos, being relegated to low economic sectors. You look at San Jose, the Mercury News, called Mercury News. You know why? Because you had mercury mines that were done with American labor. You have, people, it was called the heart of the valley, for many years in the early 19th century. And so the Bay Area is able to be the Bay Area because there has always been a working class sector, primarily people of color, but not always, who have been able to sustain the market. And so economically speaking, it makes sense where we are because we haven't allowed housing for POCs. And we've been invested in many respects in ghettoizing, right, Black and brown neighborhoods. And so you fast forward to East Palo Alto, we become incorporated in early 80s. We don't have a tax base. A lot of folks have moved out with money. We have a crack epidemic shortly after. So you have the ingredients for a city that is still struggling to have, housing for everyone because we're still trying to get on our feet. But make no mistake, it has little to do with our own merit and ability, capacity, and more the history, the racial history of urban planning, of housing planning. And so we get to this point where people can't afford to live in the Bay Area. And you've seen in the pandemic, you've seen droves of people moving out to Fresno, moving to the San Joaquin Valley, moving to the East Bay. And that has been, in so many ways, the crisis even before COVID. Yeah. Last thing I'll say is a lot of the African American population in our community has been declining. And a lot of that has been like, we're not able to really invest in our Black homeowners, allowing them when someone passes away, how can they match by, create that equity? And so, housing isn't just, to me, I look at affordable housing not just as like getting tenants the right to stay in EPA. That's a minimum. To me, justice is like, how do you get people to have the same capacity that white folks had in the turn of the century, World War II and so forth, to have the federal government investing in them? We haven't had that in terms of that seismic shift. So.
Absolutely. No, so for folks who want to learn more about this issue, there's a great book called Color of Law, which goes through this history. And one of the things that is really notable here is that Palo Alto is one of the first examples in the book. A lot of people are surprised to hear that Palo Alto is ground zero for a lot of these type of practices, but there are, suburbs, neighborhoods right around here that we pass all the time, like Ladera, right by the Stanford campus, by the 280, that was built in the 40s and where the federal government required it to be built as a whites only housing development in order to qualify for financing assistance. So this stuff isn't theoretical to our community, as you point out, Antonio. You know, it's in our bones and it's in our history. So, you know, I'd love to then transition to where we are now, right? We in Palo Alto are confronting a lot of interesting questions on housing. We have a housing element working group that's considering how are we actually going to build housing at all different levels of affordability. And we're confronting a lot of questions. People are wondering, how much space is there in Palo Alto? How do we navigate affordability while still kind of having a place for people to park and without, there being traffic and things like that? You draw a connection between these discussions and the housing injustice history that we were just talking about. Kind of what is the connection that you see between those two, and how should the history of injustice in housing inform the way that we make housing policy right now?
Yeah, I think the myth of the American enterprise or even whiteness or whatever you want to call it is, I didn't do it, therefore it's not my fault or it's not my obligation, right? An equity lens demands us to understand, no matter what color you are, you've inherited a discrete, very real, tangible set of privileges and power and resources. And if we live in a progressive place, then you have a civic and moral duty to, number one, understand those privileges, understand what you've inherited, not to feel morally bad. We all want resources. I want my kids, I want my community to have those resources. But if we have that disparity baked into our housing policy, baked in and codified into our city codes, then therefore we can't just go off the status quo. We have to go above and beyond and really serve and listen. More importantly, listen to the voices of those who haven't been able to speak historically. And what are they saying? That has been the message of the Black Lives Matter movement. That has been the message of civic justice movements across several years. And so I think the connection is, I see frankly this all with all deliberate speed, right? All deliberate speed is the language from when they were desegregating, and you had this, you had Brown versus Board, and you had this reluctance from the southern states to really desegregate. And it was sort of this slow motion. I really do fundamentally see housing justice as a racial justice issue in the Bay Area, right? It's not completely intertwined, but it is very much linked because of the aforementioned discussion we just had. And so people have to understand that race and class are always in the room, whether or not we want to acknowledge it or not. And if we are rational, sensible adults and grown planners, we have to understand that in order for us to live in order for all of us to be able to afford to live in the Bay Area, in the Silicon Valley, in the world, we have to concede a modicum of comfort. People pigeonhole the conversation as traffic. 10 minutes of traffic, that's a problem. But you know what a problem is? A single mother driving from Fresno 3 hours a day to go to the job. You know what really, struggle is? People who aren't in those neighborhoods and what they have to go through. So I think this moment of COVID demands us to have empathy. If we did not learn empathy from this pandemic, we have failed as human beings. We have failed as public servants, because the point is that not everybody has the same set of resources, and it is up to us to be the example and really be courageous, to have the political will to say, why are we not fulfilling our write-in numbers? Yeah. Why are we so reluctant? Why are we always talking about traffic? Issues they don't just reduce to one aspect. Any kind of policy is going to have aspects that are disfavorable, but we have to be candid about what is stopping that progress. And I think when it comes to my wealthier neighbors, right, Palo Alto, San Jose, I love you guys, but I think there is this inability to wrestle with the historic duty that Palo Alto has, that other cities have, to do right and rectify what has been decades and centuries of marginalization. That has nothing to do with who's an incumbent, who's on the council. It's about understanding our historical role as being in 2021. And I'm a young Latino son of Mexican immigrants telling you that I have seen people struggling during the pandemic who have been displaced. And if we gotta concede 10 minutes of traffic, the world will not end, I promise. If there will be topics about parking, that will be an issue. We will figure it out. But let it be no mistake. How do you put a price on keeping a family to stay here in the Bay Area? It boils down to the moral imperative. It boils down to living in the world you want to see. I can throw all these policy at you. I can throw all these statistics about, the economics of the ecology of like, you don't want people to drive all the way from, hours away and emitting carbon, right? But let's be honest about what's stopping this progress. Let's because if we're not honest, then what's the point of educating our kids to be leaders if we're not being the leadership we want to see? So the connection is you've inherited a duty to go above and beyond the status quo, because the status quo has been hurting my community. And I'm not pointing fingers at any particular council member. I'm pointing to the general direction of power and privilege and resource vis-a-vis this part of the world.
I think it's a powerful call to action, to be honest, about our priorities as we're making these calls and navigating these difficult questions about how to plan for affordable housing at all levels throughout the city. I just want to note, I encourage folks to put questions in the chat. I'm going to ask Antonio one or two more questions, and then I want to open it up to the floor to hear your thoughts and your questions and what is on your mind. But I want to pick up just before then on something, Antonio, you just mentioned, which is the impact that the decisions that Palo Alto has on East Palo Alto. And so,
Definitely.
We've got something that you referred to, our RHNA, our Regional Housing Needs Allocation, which is to say the state has asked us to plan for about 6,000 homes at all different levels of affordability throughout Palo Alto, wherever we like. And the question I have for you is just, why is it important that Palo Alto actually meets that obligation and takes it seriously? And conversely, if Palo Alto actually ends up dropping the ball on housing, at all income levels, how does that end up impacting your community and communities across the Bay Area?
Let me start from backwards. It is not fair to my city, a 30-plus-year-old city that has been struggling. Ladies and gentlemen, we do not have a Parks and Rec department in East Palo Alto. We furloughed jobs in 2008 that haven't recovered. We are stretched thin, and we have the heart to say we need to house people, but we have budget that is a fraction of Palo Alto's. We have a budget that is a fraction of our neighbors. And I don't say that to diss us. I'm saying let's be very real about what's going on. We are picking up the slack of other cities. Do not tell me what you can or cannot do. And talking to me as someone from East Palo Alto who has seen a community work with more with less, that is unacceptable. Like that, you can't do that magician trick on me. I understand that it is difficult, but you cannot tell me that there isn't a scarcity in Palo Alto. There is no scarcity. There is lack of political will, period, right? We can talk about logistics or policy direction or laws that have to be circumvented, sure. But to me, so much of this conversation has been, it is frustrating, frankly, to see, and it's not just Palo Alto. Again, it's not just Palo Alto. I'm not picking on Palo Alto, but we're talking about it because that's the subject of the meeting. There are other cities that have these very ambitious projects about development, about innovation. So why is it that when it comes to having test tubes and scientific marvels and planetary progress that we can imagine the unmanageable, but when it comes to finding units of housing to give a roof to people, it is suddenly quantum physics and it cannot be done. It seems to me laughable that we have this sleight of hand that, we really have this, engineering utopia in the Silicon Valley where we can imagine anything. But then when it comes to basic civic and urban planning of creating housing, suddenly, it just can't be done. Oh, it's just we don't have the means to do it. Or we are lethargic. We are institutionally lethargic to do the change that we are demanded to do. That is it. But let's not confuse A with B. And so I think for me, the frustration is one, seeing communities with so much resource not stepping up as they should and could. And two, it's also like for my city, it's like we only have as much money as our general fund allows. And we've already done so much and we will continue to do more regardless what our neighbors will do, because that's the spirit of East Palo Alto. But any rational third party will see that it is unfair to have East Palo Alto be relegated to just focusing on these projects when we have very systemic gaps in our capacity to do things, right? Our sanitation district, our water moratorium for many years. I mean, these are basic ingredients of a city. East Palo Alto is not an affordable housing project. East Palo Alto is not a set of houses. It is a city that is dynamic and that needs to be more robust. But if we continue to pick up the slack of other cities, East Palo Alto will continue to suffer and continue to struggle, I should say, not suffer, but struggle to fulfill the needs of every need of the resident. And so I call upon my council members in Palo Alto, I call upon my electeds to have the political will and courage to create the dialogues that need to be done in order to fulfill those RHNA numbers. because that is the minimum that has to be done. The state's not picking on Palo Alto. The state's treating everyone according to their means, and that is equity. So we want to be equity. We have to walk it, and this is what it means to walk it.
Yeah. I want to come back to what East Palo Alto has been doing and learn about how we can learn from the way that you're thinking about, everything from housing production to tenants' rights, rent protections, things like that. But first, I want to drop in a question that's relevant to this from Megan. Megan asks, are there any efforts for East Palo Alto and Palo Alto leadership that are going on to discuss housing across city and across county boundaries? And what is that cross-city conversation looking like? And if it's not happening, do you see, promise for a productive conversation like that to happen?
I will say that it's not happening as much as I'd like to. I sit on the Bosco Commission for Water and the agency. So in terms of housing, we have commissions in the city, and that's not my role in terms of showing up to the regional meetings and talking about housing. But I do think there is an ability for us to collaborate more. Cities partner up with JPAs, for instance, joint power authorities, and we talk about, how certain agencies that are mutually bound. But when it comes to housing, I think there is an opportunity for us to improve more. And I would be very curious to see what kind of relationship we could have with the city of Palo Alto to make sure that we can provide assistance, personnel, because EPA has been doing some terrific changes. Terrific innovations with housing. Matter of fact, we just this past couple of weeks, we had our Topa Copa, basically right of refusal. We're building into the codes. Any new units that are being built, we're going to have the ability for creating a tiered system where whenever they're being resold, that the tenant has the right, tenants in the community have the right to buy them. Then it goes to the nonprofit of their choice. Then the city becomes a third resort, right? So how do we create a safety net for units to make sure that they're affordable? We have our restricted deed income inclusionary housing ordinance we passed in 2019, where any new units, a certain amount has to be restricted to 30 to 60 AMI, 80% AMI, and so forth. I got to give a shout out to Pastor Paul Baines with his RV safe parking program, the first safe parking program in the peninsula. And so it takes really a few individuals to really step up and say, it hasn't been done. That should not be the reason why we don't do it. And I am more than confident that, I'm not privy to those conversations yet. It could be, I could be showing my age in terms of how much I've been on my council. But I will say that I'm very eager to have collaborations and understand why it is we're not getting to where we need to be in terms of fulfilling our numbers as a region, and what our city could do in terms of providing support, language, policy direction to make sure Palo Alto, with frankly more resources, can catch up and kind of emulate and model what the kind of blueprint we've done as a city to protect tenants, protect folks who are low income, protect making sure that folks don't get displaced.
Terrific. Great. So thank you, everyone. If you have more questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A. We've got a couple more questions coming in here. The next question is, what anti-displacement policies do you view as most effective from the lens of building housing in a manner that doesn't pose undue economic stress on existing vulnerable residents?
Yeah, anti-displacement measures. Like I said, I think having those Topa Copa programs where creating a safety net is really important. I think diversifying how you can allow people to keep their homes or allow the community to keep units. We have our land trust, Pahali. They've been doing terrific work. We have our brother Dwayne Bay from EPA Can Do, and they work on our BMR, below market rate units. So it's not a silver bullet, as the housing staff always love to tell us in the meeting. There's no silver bullet. There really isn't. It's really a medley of different initiatives and efforts, depending on the city size, that's gonna fit different aspects. Land trust, Copa Topas, restricted deed income. So, in terms of how not to displace people, understanding the lay of the land in terms of the housing element, in terms of policy, what are the gaps, what can be done more? I'll be frank with you. I ran on rent forgiveness, and it seems that the state not ended up de facto applying that policy, but when you look at the 80%, I think, subsidies that they were giving to some landlords in terms of like mediation and the state stepping in saying, if the landlords and the tenants fill out these applications, we'll be able to cover the majority of it. I think we have to understand that the general premise of how we run economics sometimes, which is to say that sometimes tenants are obligated to pay their rent. This pandemic has shown us sometimes it's not your fault. Sometimes it has nothing to do with your circumstance. And so how do we create programs and create safety nets so that when people are hard hit, when they've done everything in their power to try to keep up, but they can't, how can we make sure that is staying long term? So in other words, I would like to see that the programs that we had during COVID, which were the rental assistance, providing a percentage, deferring your rent. I think the state should continue, and the board of supervisors, I think the state and county should invest more monies and resources into capacitating cities to implement their own programs. So we just need more money funneled into these programs coming from the top. We live in the 5th largest economy in the world. There is no reason why we can't have more money invested in public housing. I understand we had the housing is key application, but it expired, about a month ago. And so how do we keep that ball rolling? How do we keep allowing people to roll into those programs? I think that's going to be essential to prevent displacement.
I think that's powerful. And one of the thing that is most clearly on Palo Alto's table is the next opportunity to think about long-term housing in addition to the anti-displacement measures that you've been talking about. And by the way, there's a new group in Palo Alto focused on renters and tenants' rights, which is very exciting. But the next thing on the table for Palo Alto is really this housing element, which can seem really dry to a lot of folks, right? It seems like it's a plan that determines, okay, where could housing go? What is the zoning? There are lots of acronyms, but effectively you have zonings for single family homes, sometimes for apartments, sometimes for more, sometimes for commercial. You have and you have kind of additional kind of policy constraints around how tall can things be, how close to the street can they be, things like that. What type of parking is required? So that all seems kind of dry if someone hasn't been super familiar with housing policy. But can you talk about how do you actually think about pulling some of those levers to promote equity? How do you think about pulling those levers in a way that promotes affordability, that reduces gentrification, and that promotes a lot of the good things that we've been talking about in this conversation?
Yeah, I think a lot of it has to do with that the people who are going to benefit don't come to the table because they're so busy trying to make it through next week. I think you need to create buy-in. You need to have people, first of all, be educated and understand what are these housing elements about? What are the tenets? What are the aspects of it? Because part of how power consolidates itself, part of how inequality is perpetuated is because there is kind of an obscuring of these codes and understanding what part of this community is single family housing, what part isn't. And I think part of the lever is pressure. And, at the end of the day, our electeds are beholden to the public. And if the public says in a very unanimous voice that we will not accept the current conditions in terms of housing, then at some point, even the most reactionary or conservative housing advocate is going to have to change their tune in order to get reelected. And so I think a lot of it, in my honest opinion, has to be, we have the moral imperative of like, it's wrong to not do it, but also we have to think strategic in terms of politics of like, we have to really educate people and invest in program, invest in time to have people understand what's at stake. Why is it important, for example, for people to understand what redistricting is? It's just numbers, it's just lines on a map, but how that ripples into your day-to-day life. I think the same thing is here. Maps and planning and housing elements can be very cut and dry, but it's that cut and dryness that makes it so insidious because you have people who will be drastically impacted by this who aren't able to understand it, one, because of the language and how confusing, convoluted it might be, but also just they're too busy struggling. And so we, in positions of influence and privilege, need to really create space for people to understand what's going on. And it's not just the same people preaching to the choir. And I think, community listening sessions, the old sandwich board on the block, going door to door. I mean, you got to think of it like a campaign, and the campaign is winning hearts and minds. And so the basic fundamental of it is education, education, education. I think once you educate the wider electorate about what's going on, what's at stake. Then you have people showing up to the meeting. Then you have the media picking it up, and then you start having all the cogs and nuts and bolts of democracy starting to move in your favor. So I think to me, it's looking at it beyond like the actual specs and understanding that power concedes nothing without a demand. So what is the demand of the community with respect to housing? I think the votes are there. I think the desire is there. It's just because everything's been so fragmented because of the pandemic, we have to now cohere each other into action and to really be, and that begins with informing the public of what's going on.
Totally. And one of the things that folks in our community have talked about is how do we make sure we're getting affordable, deed-restricted affordable housing, right, as we think about growing the city. And I know a lot of cities, including East Palo Alto, have pioneered a lot of different approaches here, right? They range from impact fees, inclusionary zoning, changing zoning from single family to multifamily in areas so that you can,
right,
spread out the land value across a number of different properties. Can you talk about some of those strategies? If you were sitting on the housing element committee in Palo Alto, what are some of the approaches or tactics or policies that you would suggest for making sure that we're actually getting some of these deed restricted affordable units as part of the new housing that's coming to Palo Alto?
Yeah, I think a lot of it has to do with, for example, development is a big one. I think I'm not sure what the development side for Palo Alto is, but going from my experience in East Palo Alto, we have the RBD, the Ravens Business District. That's going to be the new downtown for our city. And so a lot of what we want the future to look like is going to be premised on what kind of demands or negotiations we'll have with development. So I think it's sort of understanding, or again, it's for our particular city. If we want built into these programs X amount of invested in affordable housing, then we got to verbalize it. We got to be unanimous in that. So I think that is an opportunity first and foremost in terms of changing the lay of the land and in terms of housing. It's how are you in the future with development integrating a core affordable housing element, number one. Number two, I think it's important to with the state law that was passed, right? The proposition, the SB 9 and 10, I think that provides an opportunity to then expand housing, right? With our ADUs, JADUs, and so forth. I think that's going to be a trend benefit to the community. Obviously, it's going to get a lot of pushback, and it's been a very controversial, piece of legislation. But I think people will find that it's gonna really benefit our community, and so that's an opportunity, taking advantage of that recent legislation and how that's going to be enacted on the local level. And finally, I think it also means, I'm not sure if Palo Alto has this, but we have a rent stabilization board, and we have which is basically a city kind of adjacent commission, which is comprised of housing advocates like yourselves. And what they do is that there are landlords across the city, the biggest one being, Woodland Apartments. And we have a direct kind of almost like a watchdog, but I wouldn't use that word because it sounds a little malicious, but kind of a supervisorial role about what's happening in terms of the conditions of our tenants, providing a means of accountability, making sure that our tenants are receiving fair and equitable accommodations, and any kind of, shenanigans or issues, we are privy to. And so, appointing people in that position to keep an eye out on what's going on. But implicitly, part B of that third point is uniting all the landlords and tenants and getting people on the same page. I think part of the struggle is that we don't even know we have in common because we're so siloed into our own issues. And so once we begin to organize around housing like you all do, and get more people under the tent and understand how the north side of Palo Alto differs in housing to the south side and so forth, and then you really begin to have momentum, because you can then come with a very tangible, compelling narrative that hasn't been told. And I think I can imagine in Palo Alto, it's easy for folks to kind of do their own individual thing. But once you begin to really think as a group in terms of housing, and for example, like in EPA, the west side is going to have a different experience than the east side into the housing, right? So having those nuances built into the conversation, creating groups and commissions that are focused solely on that issue, that's going to continue to create vigilance and accountability and oversight, and making sure that the promises that were implemented or proposed 2 years ago, a year ago, 10 years ago, are going to be implemented fairly, up until the present day.
And I think that's, again, just a really important call for bringing more people into the tent, bringing a diversity of experiences, of perspectives into that tent, to make sure that we're building that common foundation. And to that point, we've got a great question here from Stephen on some of the policies that you just mentioned. Stephen asks, do you feel that tenants in EPA or PA face barriers to organizing tenants unions or associations in their buildings, which could help renters utilize TOPA and COPA effectively and help prevent displacement?
Totally. Look, I'll give you an example. The Comité de Vecinos, right? They are a Spanish-speaking predominant group in the west side of East Palo Alto, and they're very explicit. If you ask them why they were formed because their members were being intimidated. Now, do I have documentation of that? No. But if we go off the point of believing folks who are marginalized of their experiences, which I think we have to in some respect, they began to get organized because as individuals, they were being harassed and intimidated, according to them, by the respective landlords, by the respective proprietors. And so I think it's important to respect that and understand that a lot of the impediments for our tenants to come together is because there's fear. There's fear of retaliation. There's fear of what's going to happen if I start to group people together. And it goes back again to race, where you have a community and class, where you have working class people who, they might just have this program. They have a good relationship with the landlord. Maybe they let them slack off, not slack off, they defer a month and they don't want to risk it. A lot of times in East Palo Alto, I'll say personally, we fear change because so much of the change has been punitive, has been negative, has been worse. But change could also be uplifting, could be beneficial. And so in terms of Stephen's question, in my experience, yeah, I think there's a great deal, whether it's real or not, I think is beside the point. It's that the community feels that they are being harassed or they are being intimidated into not coming together, into not organizing, into not being critical of their treatment by their respective landlords and management. And I think for those folks who are on the other side of that, who are the landlords, not coming from a defensive standpoint, but saying, what could be in my leadership the reason why they're feeling that way? Is it the staff that are mistreating them? Is it a lot of it could be accounting, right? You have a lot of tenants. You may just flip flop a lot of those, tenant rates that are due or rents that are due. It could be very minute stuff, but the thing about it is people take those experiences and they become profound markers of their life. And so if we're really sincere about making change, we have to meet people where they're at. And in my experience, a lot of times our low-income tenants are coming from a place of hesitance, of anxiety economically, and of fear. And some of that fear, as I've heard from the community on the ground, they feel that if they come together and try to propose some radical changes, they're going to get less latitude, less grace, less benefits from their respective landlords and so forth. So absolutely. Thank you for that.
One of the additional questions that we have here is on office space. So an anonymous attendee writes that EPA is looking at a lot of new office space in the Ravenswood Business District specific plan update.
Right.
And the question is kind of what can EPA do to really think about the gentrification pressures that are created by new office space? And one of the, I think I would broaden that question a little bit to like, how do you think about office space in this context? How do you balance kind of the economic opportunities that might come both for the city and for residents from office space, as well as some of the gentrification pressures that you have with any changing economy or introduction of a new company to an arena? How do you think about that?
Great question. I think the mayor of our city, great city, said it best, Carlos Romero. He said, development is always about trade-offs. This isn't a win-win. This isn't a lose-lose. This is assessing the lay of the land, assessing the benefits we can get, and understanding that we are in a position historically where the East Palo Alto of the 90s is no more, or the 80s, where we were seen as undesirables, that are, places where we live were crime-ridden and violent. And now suddenly we're a lucrative part of the Silicon Valley. And, that has been in my own lifetime as a 27-year-old young man. And so for me, it's kind of wild, that we're sitting on houses that are now above $1 million in East Palo Alto. And so a lot of it is kind of grappling with that shock. But to the attendees' point, there is no silver bullet. I think it's really sitting down and understanding, what are the benefits that we're going to get from X or Y, Z project, and getting the community to say their input, and saying we want, for example, one of the things that's being proposed is, an incubator for job creation, and having, if you drive around East Palo Alto, you have a lot of small mom and pop shops on the garages, on the street corners, and the taco trucks, giving them an opportunity to be entrepreneurs in, a place in a prime time location. And so on the one hand, I look at office space to answer the question, and I do see that a lot of that job descriptions aren't going to be for communities like ours, and that's disturbing. But rather than rejecting it altogether, I would follow up and say, similar to the Amazon agreement, how can we make sure that in 5 years from now, we do have applicants, we do have people in the city? And I think we do have a sizable amount of employees, prospective employees, that can fit into those roles. We haven't seen it, we haven't done it. So we have to have the courage and calculated risk and leverage to say, these developers, you guys want this office space, but you guys have to invest in creating more intergenerational wealth for this community and allowing them to be more capacitated to get those jobs, create more assistance with our parks and rec, right? Creating more green spaces. And so I think it involves, above all, coming to the table and really creating a dialogue about what it is that we want as a city. I think, in my interactions with the developers that I've met and folks come to the meeting, a lot of them are receptive. Having that conversation, I think the more we lend our ear to hear folks out on both sides, the better we'll be as a city. Because, and I'll end with this, gentrification is an EPA. There is no way we can mitigate that, right? It is a social political fact, and we have to rise to the occasion and tackle it head on and really try to maximize our benefit as a city. And that is going to involve, I think, dialogue. That's going to involve, like I was saying earlier, with the housing issues, being strategic about how we can make sure that we're getting benefits on all sides. But it's not going to be easy. It's going to be growing pains of the city. We haven't seen that kind of development before. But certainly I'll be committed, as a council member and as an elected, to really have the community's interest at heart, and to make sure that just because we haven't seen it before doesn't mean that we can't benefit from it. EPA deserves to have the same resources as any other city. And I look forward to a near future where we're going to be a robust, dynamic economy. Because I don't want to go to a budgetary meeting again, and hear the Four Seasons Hotel 5 different times, right? Because our money relies on a few amount of institutions. That's not a city. So we have to really be bold to demand more for the community and be creative in getting it. So it's not an easy question. It's not an easy question, not an easy solution, for sure.
Well, Antonio, we're close to time, so I want to bring it back just to where we started, which was on the topic of allyship and movement building on issues of equity and issues of housing. And I really like one of the things that you wrote in the op-ed, which was, quote, "To all my neighbors in Menlo Park and Palo Alto, the next time you think about joining a march, by all means do so, but don't let your allyship stop there. Stop once you put down the picket sign," end quote. And so I think the last question for you would just be, for all the folks in the room, many of whom are in Palo Alto, what does good allyship look like? What are the actions? What are the questions you want people to ask that are going to move the dial on the issues that we've been talking about this evening?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, I want to just applaud everyone here for showing up. I think good allyship isn't a checkbox. Good allyship isn't a discrete set of actions to say, I donated $50 or 70, I've met my quota, call it a day. It is a marathon. It is a lifetime task. And so many ways, it might not be a satisfactory answer. Maybe it is, depending on who you are. But understanding that showing up is more than half the battle. Being comfortable with the uncomfortable, and understanding that the positions that you hold are the ones that we want everyone to have, but they don't have. That's just a social fact that we got to start off with. And so I think in terms of allyship, it's going to look different for everybody. It's going to look different for different people, whatever is within their physical, economic means. But some concrete things, right? Like, it depends if you want education, right? If you want to uplift the disparities in education, being able to tutor to our, donating to our Foundation for College Education or College Track, or showing up to mentor some students of ours in our city, or I mentioned rent, right? There are, if you talk to some folks in my community, there's a handful of folks, like maybe 6, 7, 10, who like really, really need help with rent. And we can identify them and we know them. And there are channels where informally I'd add, where we can, assist those particular families with that rent. And really, I said this earlier today when I was speaking to another group of folks, it's like change is structural for sure, but it begins on a local level, and it begins by just meeting people one-on-one, one by one, right? The way that one gets elected, right? It wasn't like one all, it was like every single person I met made a difference. I think the same thing is gonna happen with allyship, that it's not this utopian vision that'll be realized overnight. It's like, what are the relationships you have on a day-to-day basis? And are they making you grow and think as a person? Because you can donate all the money in the world, but if you don't change as a person, then you have not allied. You have to the point of changing how and change is that not just the folks on the marginalized community are changing, but you yourself as a privileged person have also changed. And so how are you interfacing in the community so that you too will transform? I think allyship isn't about a money figure. It's not about how much hours you put into an organization. It's about being candid with yourself and reflexive about what you've done, what you can do, and what are going to be the places and people to keep you accountable, to push you to continue to give back. And always understand that there's no limit. It's every day is a new opportunity. And I would just say, don't beat yourself up if you feel you're falling short. We make mistakes. It's not about succeeding or failing. It's about failing better each time, right? Erring on the side of like, I showed up, and that's going to be appreciated. That's going to be embraced, and the rest we're going to work it out. But it's about creating those relationships, creating authentic relationships, and changing because of that.
Well, I know that's a call to action that resonates with me, and I hope it resonates with everyone else on the call. Just a huge thanks to Antonio for sharing his expertise and his perspective, and thanks to the audience for some really great questions. Before I close it out, just want to share 2 opportunities for how to get engaged. First, if you would like to help with Palo Alto Forward's advocacy and organizing efforts around our upcoming housing element, please visit paloaltoforward.com. There's a whole section there on our housing element, and you can learn to get involved, how to get involved there. And then second, I hope you'll be able to join next month's Housing Element speaker series on November 17th. That'll be our rescheduled date for our conversation with Professor Chris Elmendorf from UC Davis. We'll be talking about a bunch of whole new housing laws that have been passed over the last couple of years and what they mean for Palo Alto. And I see Angie has her hand up.
Just one correction, that one is changed to the 16th.
The 16th.
November 16th.
November 16th will be Chris Elmendorf, and that'll be in the email that you'll get if you're signed up for our emails through paloaltoforward.com. So again, huge thanks to Antonio for a great event, and hope to see everyone this time next month.
Thank you all so much for having me. Stay encouraged.
Thanks, Antonio. Take care.